So we added our routes for the edit component. Now let's go to that component and retrieve the ID and therefore determine whether we are in edit mode or not. I will inject the activated route in there as you learned it before from @AngularRouter. And in ng-on-init, this is a good place to now retrieve the ID. As before, I want to do this dynamically, so I will use my route and the params observable and subscribe to that. And here I will receive my params, which are of type params. And here I then want to retrieve the ID on which I'm currently working. I will store the ID here in a property named, or not named ID, but of type number. So here I will set this ID equal to plus to convert it into a number, params ID, because that's the name of our dynamic parameter in our route setup, right? With that, we retrieve that ID here, but I also want to find out whether I'm editing the recipe or creating a new one. I actually want to store this information in a new property, edit mode maybe. I'll set it to false initially, so initially could say we assume that we are creating a new recipe. We are not in edit mode. Now I will check this whenever the parameters change. Then I will assign a new value to edit mode, and here I will simply assign the value of the following check. I want to see if params has an ID property. So if it has one, then this will actually be a string with the ID, otherwise it will be undefined. So by comparing it to null and checking if it is not null, I'm checking does it have the ID. Because params, and that there the ID, will only be not undefined if we are in edit mode, because then an ID will be present. If this check returns true, so if the ID indeed is undefined and therefore equal to null, this will return false because I'm checking the opposite, and therefore we are in new mode. And we can check this by simply logging it in the console here, edit mode. Let's see if this works. We're at 0 edit here, and it returns true. And now we're at new, and it returns false. So that seems to work. This is a nice way of checking in which mode we are. So with that, we are able to retrieve the ID of the element we want to edit and to find out whether we are in edit mode or not. Now I want to make this edit link here work and the new recipe link, because these are both things which are not working as of now. Let's work on this next. And actually, this is a nice challenge for you. Make these links work. Make sure that when we click this link or this button, we get taken to the recipes new page or the recipes edit page for that respective recipe we had loaded. It's a nice challenge for you. In the next lecture, we can view my solution together. So were you successful hooking up these buttons? Let's do it together. I want to start with the new recipe button. And for that, I'll go to my recipe list component, which is where I have this button here. And I simply want to add a click listener to it. On new recipe could be a fitting name. So let's copy that name and add it to our TypeScript code so that here we have the method which will get triggered. And now I need to inject the router to be able to navigate to this route I want to go to. So I'll add my router here of type router to be imported from @AngularRouter here. So I'll add this import. And with that, in on new recipe, I simply want to target or use my router to use the navigate method to target this path I want to go to. Now, which path is that? We already are on /recipes here. Keep this in mind because we're on the recipe list. So I can use a relative route and simply add new to it. Now, to be able to use a relative route in the navigate method though, we also need to inform the router about our current route. So let's inject this too. Here the route, of course, of type activated route needs to be added. An activated route should also be added from the @AngularRouter package. And then I'll add my JavaScript object, add the relative to configuration, and point to this route, to my current route. With that, let's see if that works. Back in the application, let's try this new recipe button. That looks great. So let's try going to just recipes, works, select a recipe, works too. So that is indeed working as expected. Now we should do the same basically for the edit recipe, though there we also need to pass our ID. The recipe detail component is of course the place where we have this link here, the edit recipe link. So I'll add a click listener and say on edit recipe here. I'll also copy this name into the TypeScript code of the edit recipe component, like this. And then here we also need to get access to the router so that we can call the navigate method. So let's inject it of type router as before. Make sure to import the router from @Angular router. And now that is why I stored the ID in this property here. With that stored, I can now use my router here to navigate. And I want to navigate, well, basically to the current ID and then add it. Now I could simply add it to the current route. So let's add relative to here, this route. And let's see if this works as expected. If I click edit recipe, we go to 0 added and the same for 1. So actually we don't need the ID here in this case then. Why did I get it then? Well, simply for demo purposes. This is an absolutely fine way and probably the way you will navigate. The alternative though, and just to show this how that would work and to practice this, is to use navigate. And now let's say we move up one level and then we want to add our ID again, so this ID, and then add it. So now I'm deliberately constructing a more complex path, simply to show how that would work. So now that is also relative to our current route, so this route. And with that you should see that it still works, because what we do is we go up one level, so to just /recipes in this case. Then we again add our ID and then add it. And we should see that if I click this button again, even if we reload the app to be sure that it did indeed update, it works as before, now with a more complex setup. Again, you would probably use the first one, which is, well, comment out the second one. I just wanted to highlight again how that works, how you can use that more complex navigation and also navigate around with this go up one level command you see here as the first segment of this more complex path. However, again, just adding edit to the relative or to the current route, I should say, is of course the straightforward way. In the last lectures, we added a lot of routing functionality to our app. It's looking pretty good. We got all the main pieces tied together. One thing I want to bring to your attention again is we are subscribing to params here in the detail component and in the edit component. Now, as I explained, you don't need to clean up the subscription here. I just want to bring it to your attention again. In other cases, where you use your own observables you created and not managed by Angular therefore, you will need to clean up this subscription. So definitely keep that in mind if you work with your own observables. Here for now, we can simply proceed with this setup and let Angular do the cleanup work. Welcome to this course module. In the last course module about routing, we had first contact with observables. Now, I want to dive deeper into observables in this section. Now, you could create a whole course about observables, so we're not going to dive that deeply into them, but I want you to understand what observables actually are and what you could use them for and why Angular uses them. So what is an observable? An observable basically can be thought of as a data source. Now, in our Angular project, an observable basically just is an object we import from a third-party package, RxJS. The observable here is implemented in a way that it follows the observable pattern. So we have an observable and we have an observer. In between, we have a stream, a timeline. And on this timeline, we can have multiple events emitted by the observable, or data packages, you could say, emitted by that observable, depending on the data source of that observable, of course. So the observable could emit data because you trigger it to do so. You can do that programmatically. It could be connected to a button, and therefore whenever the button is clicked, an event in a data package is emitted automatically. Or, as the Angular HTTP service does it, it's connected to a HTTP request. So when the response returns, the response is emitted as a data package. And there are dozens of other data sources too. We will have a look on where to find more soon. So, as I said, the other part is the observer. This actually is your code, you could say. It's this subscribe function you saw earlier, or at least it has something to do with that. There, you have three ways of handling data packages. You can handle the normal data, you can handle errors, or you can handle the completion of the observable. Because these are the three types of data packages you can receive. And in these hooks, in these boxes, you could say, your code gets executed. So you can determine what should happen if I receive a new data package, what should happen if I receive an error, what should happen when the observable eventually completes. Side note, an observable doesn't have to complete. There are observables, for example, hooked up to a normal button, which never complete, because how would you know when it completes? A user could click the button how often the user wants, right? Other observables, like the HTTP request on the other hand, will have a clear end and will complete eventually, because once the response is there, what else should happen? It's done. So this is how the observable pattern generally works. And of course you use it to handle asynchronous tasks. Because all these data sources here, user events triggered in your code, or a HTTP request, are asynchronous tasks. You don't know when they will happen, and you don't know how long they will take. So if you execute your normal application code, you don't want to wait for these events, or you don't want to wait for the completion of such a HTTP request, because that would block your program, would block your logic. Therefore, we need methods of handling such asynchronous tasks, and historically you might have used callbacks or promises, and it's not necessarily bad to use them. Observables is just a different approach of handling that, a different alternative, and Angular embraces observables, which is why, well, I chose to explain these, because Angular uses them a lot. And actually, observables have one major advantage: they're operators, which I will show later in this section too. Back to this slide. So we got our observable and we got our observer with the three buckets, you could say, or with the three hooks where different code is executed depending on the type of package we receive. And then exactly this happens. The observable might emit a couple of normal data packages, it might emit an error, or eventually it might get completed and the respective code is then executed. So that's the theory. Let's now take a closer look in our actual project.